As a global manufacturer with long-held values of innovation and sustainability, we at Milliken understand our responsibility to tackle the difficult issues, both human and environmental, that we all face. That's why we've strengthened our commitment to building a healthier future by publishing planet, product, and people sustainability goals, including reducing our global footprint, creating more circular economies, and caring for our internal and external communities.
Good day, everyone. I'm Brennan Lafferty, publisher of Sustainable Plastics and Plastics News. Welcome to Ask the Expert, our new live stream series. Now, with Ask the Expert, this is your chance to engage with professionals, to address the current business environment, to discuss new developments, and most importantly, to ask questions. This week's topic is of vital importance: plastics recycling and the circular economy. And we have 4 live streams scheduled this week dealing with supply chain collaboration, trends in technology, the recyclability of plastics, and reducing energy. Today's topic is how supply chain collaboration yields better circular results. Our expert today is Mr. Scott Trenor, Principal Scientist from Milliken. Now, Scott will answer your questions after his presentation. That said, you can submit your questions at any time. To submit a question, simply email spevents@crane.com, or if you're watching this broadcast on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube, send your questions through those platforms. With that, I'll turn things over to Scott Trenor, Principal Scientist at Milliken. Take it away, Scott.
Hey, Brennan. Thanks for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we go through some of our thoughts about supply chain collaborations and yielding better circular results for plastics. So what I'd like to do is kind of on the next slide, let's briefly go over the agenda. I'd like to briefly introduce the problems that plastics are facing in our environment right now, and then focus on some of their many benefits. I won't spend much time on this because I think we're all pretty familiar with the issues. Where I'd like to spend the majority of the time is around this life cycle here on the image on the right. So starting with raw materials, manufacturing, use, collection, and recovery, and give examples of where we think that choices can be made to make a more sustainable future. And then spend a little bit of time on that gap right there at the top between recovery and raw materials, and look at some of the emerging PCR streams that are available to, or becoming available to bridge that gap. So in the next slide, we'll look at the problems that plastics are facing, right? So they have an end-of-life issue, and more specifically, they have an end-of-life mismanagement issue. And those issues are leading national or countries, municipalities to choose to ban plastics rather than maybe solve the actual problems that they're needing. So on the next slide, we'll see some of the problems that I think that plastics can solve, as published by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So in terms of food waste and extending shelf life, plastic packaging can play a significant role in that. And we'll see an example of that coming up in a couple of minutes. And then plastic packaging can not only reduce fuel consumption during delivery of foods, but lightweighting of automobiles has greatly driven up miles per gallon fuel efficiency. So on the next slide, we'll look at a couple of the problems that we're trying to solve here, right? And these are based on the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And the 2 we'll focus on here are zero hunger and climate action. And we'll take a quick look at how plastics can help solve some of those issues. So in the next slide, we see the first one around zero hunger. And the Food and Ag Organization at the United Nations published a report a few years ago where they looked at where food is wasted along the supply chain. I think the study year was 2011, and in that year, they estimated that 1.6 gigatons of food was wasted somewhere along the supply chain, with a considerable amount of that being in the distribution and consumption phase. And the carbon footprint that's associated with those losses is significant too. In that same year, if food wastage was a country, it would have been the 3rd largest carbon emitter in the world. And where plastic packaging plays an important role there is it can extend the shelf life of the common foods that we eat and see and eat every day. I have a couple examples here. Bananas, for instance, you can more than double the shelf life of bananas with a simple polyethylene shrink wrap. Red meat, that's a little more complex of a packaging system, but again, the shelf life increases from about 3 to almost 3 days to about a month. So helping get that food safely to the end users and consumers. And there are lots of options for packaging, right? And on the next slide, we'll dive into a little bit into why plastic should be the preferred option. So next slide, please. So, the ACC published a paper a few years back on the lowest environmental impact for plastics. And what they did was they took a broad survey of several hundred applications and looked at what would happen if you replaced that plastic packaging with glass or aluminum or steel or cardboard. And what they found is generally the plastic packaging had a lower environmental footprint. And a couple of those indicators are shown here with water consumption, global warming potential, acidification, and unfortunately solid waste is shown here, where I think as we discuss going forward, we'd prefer it not be solid waste, but recycled raw material for next of life. Now, that's a very general study. I think if we look more specifically at plastic packaging for beverages, we can look at the results from this LCA from Norway, where they looked at the CO2 footprint for delivering 1,000 liters of beverage. And they looked at the typical packagings that we would see for that, right? So we'd see glass bottles, aluminum cans, bag and box, cardboard cartons, and then we see the virgin PET. This is 100% virgin and material to deliver 1,000 liters, and it's only 123 kilograms of CO2 for that packaging, which compares very favorably to glass bottles and aluminum cans for that matter. I think we can improve on that, and this begins to show the importance of recycling plastics and all materials, really. As we looked at that aluminum can with 100% recycled content, it's only about 100 kilograms. But even more impressive is that 100% rPET bottle is only 7 kilograms of CO2 to deliver 1,000 liters of beverage. To put that in perspective, comparing that to that glass bottle, that's less than 1% of the carbon footprint. So as we go on to the next slide, we could start looking at how we design packaging and products for a more sustainable future. So as we're selecting materials as raw materials, we want to ensure that those materials are safe. They want to be suited for the product. You want them to be abundantly available so you're not running out in the middle of your production run. And then as we think about the next life, is you want materials that are valuable for the next life. Because as we think of the recycling supply chain, how it works now, is once that MRF separates out the material, it has to have value for them to separate it. So they have to have some sort of marketing commodity. And then finally, you want to pick a raw material with the lowest environmental footprint. So on the last slide, we saw that plastics were generally advantaged to other materials, and we saw how recycled PET was advantaged to virgin PET. And that recycling of plastics holds for the other commodity materials that we see. So both recycled polyethylene and polypropylene, as shown here from the results of a life cycle analysis from the Association of Plastics Recyclers. And what we're looking at is a comparison in environmental factors of it's curbside to gate of making recycled polypropylene, polyethylene, or PET pellets compared to the extraction to gate of making virgin materials. And we see very quickly that there are significant advantages when it comes to total energy, global warming, acidification, and smog formation when you use a recycled pellet versus a virgin pellet. Again, if we're focused on CO2, which I think is an excellent target, we're talking at about 70 to 75% reductions in using recycled materials versus virgin. So as we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the packaging form. And again, it's hard to kind of separate this from the raw material, but when we think about packaging, there are a number of considerations such as function. What is it holding? Is it a carbonated beverage? Is it not? Is it hot filled? How long does it have to store the food safely? What's the form of the package? How are you going to make it? If we're thinking about coffee pots, for instance, you could thermoform those or you can injection mold that. And both of those raw materials would require different sets of properties. And then you want to pick a material with the lowest environmental footprint. So as we saw in the previous slide, starting with recycled feed streams is an excellent place to reduce the environmental footprint of a package. And then finally, you want to think about end of life. And there are a couple of resources that I'd like to point out. So the first is the Association of Plastics Recyclers Design Guide for Plastics Recyclability, where they go into great detail on raw material selections, color and size, shape that could affect the recyclability or the potential of that material or package to get through a MRF. Recycle Class from PRE is also an excellent resource, and I believe Paolo will be giving a presentation on that in this seminar series on Thursday. And then once you have a properly designed package, you need to let the consumer know that that's recyclable. We've shown a couple of the recycling marks here that are used around the world. And the one that I'd like to point out is the Sustainable Packaging Coalition's How to Recycle label. Because not only does it tell the consumer that the package is recyclable, it also helps them with some additional information on how best to prepare that package for its next life. So once we're designing and manufacturing, we kind of go into the next slide, which is the use phase. It's a little difficult for us to affect that on the design or on the material supply chain, but as consumers ourselves, what we can do is we can choose products with recycled content. And I've shown a couple images here of a product that was formerly made from virgin plastics that has or is transitioning to recycled content. And in some cases, it's really difficult for me, let alone I think a consumer, to tell the difference between the two packages unless it says, as the two of them do here, 100% recycled content. But for the package in the middle, there's a fairly clear difference between the two. And that's really due to the available recycled feed stream. And I think it's also a good example of where you can educate the consumer that, we're changing our packaging to make a difference and increase recycled content. And specifically in this case, I believe they increased they used ocean-bound plastics as their recycled content. So again, sticking on the consumer side, there are a couple of resources that we could point out. So More Recycling's Buy Recycled Products Directory has a nice example and list of suppliers from home goods and furniture to apparel that have recycled content. And then more from the industry side, the APR's Demand Champions has a list of suppliers that offer packaging that already has recycled content. And not only that, but it's quite difficult to change a consumer-facing product, but internally you can increase your recycled content used by using pallets and crates and other shipping containers that can contain recycled plastics. And the APR's Demand Champions can lead you into that direction and show you suppliers of those materials. So in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about collection. And I think every topic we've discussed could be discussed for days, let alone the 30 seconds to a minute we're spending here on each one. So for collection, we decided to touch a little bit about commingled and single source. So commingled is typically one large bin. It's a little more common here in the US than it is in Europe. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these. So the commingled tend to get higher volumes and the lower costs due to only picking up one package at each household. But that higher volume comes at a cost of higher contamination, as shown here from this report from the Recycling Partnership, where the commingled bin has about 5 percentage points increase in contamination rate. That increase in contamination rate conversely gives higher yield for source separated systems. And here in the US, where we don't collect films curbside, we need to also think about alternative collection systems for flexibles with the store take back. So on the next slide, once we collect the material, it goes into the recycling system, right? And ideally, 100% that's collected goes into recycled packaging. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So in the US, the majority of packaging is landfilled, whereas in the US, it's burned. In Europe, it's burned for energy. And that's really due to legislation and regulatory shifts. So as landfill bans in Europe promoted switch to recycling and energy recovery, whereas in the US, low tipping fees have encouraged landfilling of post-consumer waste, as it's just way cheaper to landfill than it is to either recycle or burn for energy, unfortunately. There are some states that have bottle deposit programs, and those have reached quite high recovery rates. So in some cases above 90%. And legislatively, that's fueling conversations regarding expansion of those bottle deposit programs, as well as extended producer responsibility. So on the next slide, as we kind of finish up this circle, we go from recovery to raw materials, and we're really trying in the industry to bridge that final gap. We've been very linear for a number of years, going from feedstock to monomers to plastic production to part production, use sorting, which we've discussed today, and then into that mechanical recycling loop. But in some cases, the pellets that come out of mechanical recycling loop don't meet all the requirements for part production, so we need a more advanced recycling scheme. The first one I'll touch on is purification, which is really close to mechanical recycling in that we don't really affect or change the polymer backbone. We just dissolve and strip out any impurities or colors that may affect that final part, produce pellets that can go back into that part production loop. For polyamides and PET, we can undergo depolymerization. And whereas this is kind of growing now quite quickly, it's probably one of the older recycling steps, as PET has been recycled by depolymerization since the 70s. And that product produces monomers, which can go directly back into the plastics production. And then for other materials like mixed olefin streams that you can't depolymerize, or maybe you won't want to purify, you can go back to conversion via either pyrolysis or gasification, which has a slightly larger loop and takes you way back into the feedstock production. You know, there are advantages to all these systems. As we move from right to left, we technically can get to less pure streams. So, you know, fillers don't affect conversion quite as much as they would affect mechanical recycling. But then as we go from right to left, the energy inputs and costs become higher. So one example on the next slide that I'd like to give about purification is a technology being scaled by PureCycle Technologies. It's focused on polypropylene. And in essence, they dissolve and strip out all the impurities in polypropylene. And the image here on the right gives you a quick snapshot into how the pellets would look, or how the plastic would look with and without the PureCycle technology. I think a better example is on the next slide here, where we look at a non-traditional recycle stream. And what they've done here is they've gotten agglomerated carpet face fiber that's polypropylene from circular polymers. They've run that through their purification system, resulting in the pellets there shown in the middle. And then finally, we were fortunate enough to get a small sample of that, which we injection molded into these portion cups, which hold about 16 ounces or a little less than a liter. So I think this is an excellent circularity study, and we're taking a material that would have been landfilled or burned and changing that into a food contact container. So another example I'd like to show is on the next slide with our Delta Max family of additives. We launched these about 2 years ago for the recycling industry to help solve a problem that they've been struggling for a while, and that's the processability toughness trade-off. So many consumer groups want to use more recycled content, and I think the pictures here show some excellent examples of where recycled polypropylene can go, but it's difficult, or can be difficult, to mold large parts with low melt flow materials. And typically the higher melt flow polypropylenes that are available may not have the toughness or impact strength to make a durable good. So in working with a customer, they were making a large container with 30% recycled polypropylene content, which is great. But they were having to add 70% virgin to make that material flow in such a way that they could fill their molds and have a durable enough product. So in working with us, we were able to come up with a solution where we increased that recycled content from 30% to 100%, adding just half a weight percent of our Delta Max 8 M100. And that afforded about a doubling of the melt flow of the recycled material, so from about a 20 to about a 40, and increased impact strength so that we ensured that they were producing durable goods. So kind of summarizing up on the next slide, we have lots of choices going forward trying to develop this and get into this sustainable development goals from the UN. We touched a little bit about how plastics could help in zero hunger. If the use of increased use of recycled plastics with their lower CO2 footprint would help with climate action, also affordable energy. I think with our collaborations with folks at the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, we're looking at improving life underwater. And, as plastic part designers, as industry, we have lots of choices to make, and all of these choices have sometimes unintended consequences or other trade-offs. And it's our responsibility to make the best choices for a sustainable future. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, great presentation, Scott. We do have lots of questions coming in, not surprisingly. As a reminder, to submit a question to Scott, you have several ways you can do that. You can email spevents@crane.com, or if you're watching the live stream on one of the social media platforms, send your question through those platforms. All right, Scott, let's start off with one of the questions about recycling. Can you talk a little bit about the average recycled content of aluminum cans? And then related, what is being done to improve recovery of materials in the US so we can catch up to our friends in Europe?
Yeah, so those are two good questions, and the answer to the first one is interesting. So the average recycled aluminum content in a can in the US is 70%, according to I think it's the Aluminum Can Association. In Europe, that's only 50%, but recovery in the US for aluminum cans is also only 50%. So keeping a 70% recycled content is going to be difficult going forward as those supply chains kind of dry up. And, as far as what we're doing, I think there are a number of smaller projects that are quite important going on now that are touch on increasing recovery. So the Material Reclamation for the Future program just finished up outside of Philadelphia, and they looked at taking flexible packaging curbside, just published their final report. The Recycling Partnership is launching a polypropylene recycling coalition where they're looking at making targeted investments at MRFs to specifically increase polypropylene recycling rates. Then I think the other option is, a lot of the MRFs in the US are a little bit old, they're aged, and they were designed around paper, essentially, along with aluminum and steel cans. So projects like the Plastics Industry Association secondary MRF showed how a second sortation step after our current MRFs could help increase recovery of plastics and other materials that kind of slip through the chain, if you will.
Yeah, we certainly have a bit of an infrastructure problem here in the US for our MRFs, no doubt. Here's a question that came in through LinkedIn. Scott, you were talking about CO2 emissions. The question is, does your analysis take into account the life cycle emissions for any of those materials?
Yeah, so, I think life cycle emissions is one of those newer calculations coming in through LCAs. So the data we've shown does take into that in a certain effect, right? It's a difficult one for me to answer specifically because we didn't do the studies, but in all, they do take into life cycle emissions in terms of use. And then I know the APRs also takes into account all the emissions from the recycling trucks running recycled plastics from the home to the MRFs.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's fair. So here's a question that came in through email. You showed the example of the carpets. This question is related to carpet. How is Milliken approaching recycled content for carpet products?
Yeah, so that would be a much better question to ask our flooring group. But, for our nylon-based carpets, polyamide-based carpets, we do have recycled content offerings available on the market. Mm-hmm. And it varies depending on what the customer wants. So we have carpet that varies from 100% recycled content in the face fiber to 100% virgin, depending on what their needs are.
Okay, very good. You mentioned PureCycle. Can you describe Milliken's partnership with PureCycle?
Yeah, so we're fortunate enough to be one of a handful of their strategic partners. So for us, PureCycle is a little bit like mechanical recycling in that what comes in affects what goes out versus, say, the pyrolysis where you're remaking polypropylene or polyethylene from the raw materials. So there are some cases that they'll need a specific additive package for a specific application, and that's where we're there to help them develop those types of specialty grades.
And you showed, if my memory serves, you showed that that serving container. So can you explain a little bit? I know it's not always companies aren't always able to meet food grade approvals, and you're able to do that, though, it appears.
Yeah, so that was, I guess, a hypothetical food storage container, since PureCycle is actually in the process of their FDA non-objection letter testing right now. So they're doing the extraction testings to show that, their process can remove the contaminants of concern, for allowing the material to make its way back into food contact applications. Okay,
very good. On Deltamax, questions come in from a processor, a converter. We are already using 100% PCR. What kind of value can Deltamax offer for a company like us?
Yeah, so it can offer a couple of options, right? So it's set up to do, I guess, two different things depending on what you're trying to do. It either increases flow while maintaining impact strength, or can also increase impact strength at higher flow. So, what it would allow your customers to do is to inject faster, reduce cycle times, and then reduce energy use or consumption during injection molding.
And here's a follow-up question, a separate one. Came in through email. Can Deltamax be used in clear or natural applications?
So the current product, as it is it has a orange color, so it's not going to function very well. It functions perfectly well in clear or natural. The product just won't remain clear or natural. That said, we're launching a second generation later this year, beginning of next year, that is designed for clear natural applications.
And Scott, you may have touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the recycling trucks. Another LinkedIn question. Do you take into account logistics? If yes, what components are important in that segment of a life cycle?
So it depends on which life cycle we're talking about. So when we first talked about the PET bottles and the delivering of beverage, that does take into logistics, and that's one of the reasons plastics are advantaged, right? So compared to a glass bottle that holds a liter of beverage to a PET bottle, it's a lot lighter. You're moving a lot less packaging. So that LCA definitely takes into account the logistics of returning this bottle. In the APR life cycle, they also take into account logistics. So it's based in the US, so it's a recycling truck coming curbside, picking it up, delivering that to a MRF, and then the MRF delivering it to a reclaimer. So all of those are taken into account. In terms of what are important, the better gas mileage your truck goes, that's one of the bigger features, because whereas plastics are light, they're also not terribly dense. So you don't want to be shipping an empty truck or a light truck around.
Yeah. All right. Boy, thank you so much for all these questions that are coming in from the viewers. LinkedIn question. Scott, can you please say a little bit about their challenges of recyclability? For example, there are many consumer products that cannot be recycled until we make basic changes at the design phase. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so it's correct, right? And I think resources like the APR's design guide and PRE's recycle class, I think what they're doing is they're putting many of the requirements to make a package recyclable in an easy to obtain single source. So you're not having to go on myths or speculation on will this get recycled? Will it make it through a star screen? Will it get lost somewhere else? So I think using those tools, designers can help design packages that are made to make it through the recycle stream and the recycling process.
Okay. So our first question from YouTube, Scott. So you're ready for a YouTuber here.
Yeah.
How is Milliken approaching reusing single-use plastics that have been contaminated with highly hazardous fluids? I mean, there's so many contaminants out there that can come into the stream at any point, whether it's at the consumer's end or even at the MRF. Any thoughts on contamination from hazardous fluids?
Well, I think it's not just hazardous fluids, but let's talk about biohazards too, right? So with the current COVID situation, there's a lot of non-woven polypropylene masks that are destined to end up somewhere, unfortunately, probably burned for energy or landfilled. And I think that's where the advanced recycling systems come into play. So if you think about pyrolysis and you have a plastic going through the pyrolysis system, so we're talking about 400 or 500 degrees C in an inert atmosphere, those hazardous materials, no matter really what they are not going to make it through those systems. So in that case, yeah, you have to take a little longer, more energy intensive loop, but you can still get those raw materials in a safe way back into the circular supply chain.
All right, going back to PureCycle, another question. Is there a time frame for scaling that technology?
Yeah, so their pilot plant has been running for about a year now. They are in the final design stages for their first plant, which is going to be in Ironton, Ohio. I think that should be online in somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. And then they're also working on site selections for additional plants in North America and Europe.
Okay. I might be able to answer this next question, Scott, but I'm not the expert here. Brand owners have made commitments. We've seen this. We've reported on this ourselves. Have made commitments for high PCR content. Will there be enough material available for this?
Unfortunately, I think the short answer to that is not right away.
Right.
The recycling supply chain and infrastructure needs some significant improvements, both here and in Europe. I think Recycling Partnership has estimated that to be about $10 billion of upgrades in the US. And then on top of that, we as society need to do a better job putting stuff in the recycle bins. City of New York had their, I think it's every 3-year review of recycling and solid waste. And, when they measured the PET bottles that were in the recycle bin versus in the refuge bin, it was something like 70% or 65% were in the trash bin, not in the recycle bin. Aluminum had similar numbers, and, we should know better, at least about aluminum by now. So I think there's almost, unfortunately, hopefully it's not a generational switch that's required to increase those recycle rates. But we have a long way to go to meet everyone's supply chain and PCR content demands.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's certainly an educational, continuing educational, problem that we face with on the consumer front. All right, let's try to get through a couple more. I know we're past our time, and thank you for everyone who stayed with us. Your questions indicate great interest here. Scott, an emailed question. Do you have any information on PCR polypropylene in films?
Not probably anything specific. I mean, it's for something to go back into films, right? It needs to have some pretty specific processing requirements in terms of melt flow and melt strength. And you almost need to have a polypropylene dedicated polypropylene film recycle stream dedicated to stay in that loop. So right now, I don't. That might be one of those areas that necessitate the chemical recycling type process moving forward.
Okay. All right, let's go with one more from YouTube. Scott, you mentioned a series of chemical recycling companies. Do you know what some of the byproducts of these processes are and how companies are having to deal with them?
Yeah, so it's going to vary greatly, but anything that is used to color or fill plastics are going to be byproducts. There's been some reports in the literature on, I guess, Plastics Energy's pyrolysis program, and they tend to get about, I think it's 7 to 10% char, so carbon black kind of at the end of it. I don't know what that is. It has to be dealt with in a certain way. I'm sure it's not an area I'm an expert in. Okay,
fair enough. All right, so Scott, we got to ask you about those fruit. There's a box and bag of Fruit Loops behind you. Is that your breakfast, or is that? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I guess it's over this shoulder, right? So It's interesting. So we talk about plastic packaging, and we have lots of examples of plastic packaging in the background and one cardboard box. And for that, it's an example of our UltraGuard family of additives. So next to that cardboard box is the actual polyethylene bag of Fruit Loops. And what UltraGuard does is it increases the barrier for polyethylene, and that allows a converter to either down gauge and use less plastic, maybe meet some of their sustainability goals that way. Or if they keep the same gauge film and add UltraGuard, it'll extend the shelf life of the Fruit Loops in this case, which I guess goes towards the reduction in food spoilage. So it's a good circularity product or sustainability product to help us solve some of these SDG goals and get through some of these problems we're seeing.
Yeah, backs up a lot of what you were saying earlier about plastic's importance in maintaining food shelf life, literally.
Okay.
Well, Scott, let's call it an end there. Thanks to everybody for all your questions. Scott, do you have any parting words of advice for our viewers today about supply chain collaboration?
Yeah, it's unfortunately not a simple solution or a one answer fits all type of solution that we're looking for. So we really do need to work across the supply chain, and each part of that chain needs to help each other. And, I think with converters demanding more recycled content, it'll help go towards that infrastructure to create more supply for those materials. So I think that sums it up. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. I very much appreciate you joining us.
Well, Scott, thanks again for sharing your insights. If you would like to reach out to Scott, and I know many of you have more questions that we couldn't get to, his email address is on the screen there. I know he'd be happy to talk to you. My thanks again to our expert, Scott Trenor, Principal Scientist from Milliken. My thanks to you for joining us today for Ask the Expert. Our sustainability and plastics recycling and circular economy conversation continues Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern here in the States and at 4 p.m. Central European time. Our topic Wednesday is trends in technology in the circular economy. Our expert, Mr. Walter Ripple of Aviant, formerly known as Poly1. Until then, have a great day. I'm Brennan Lafferty. Thanks for watching Ask the Expert with Sustainable Plastics and Plastics News. Stay tuned for a parting message from Milliken.
As a global manufacturer with long-held values of innovation and sustainability, we at Millikin understand our responsibility to tackle the difficult issues, both human and environmental, that we all face. That's why we've strengthened our commitment to building a healthier future by publishing planet, product, and people sustainability goals, including reducing our global footprint, creating more circular economies, and caring for our internal and external communities.